Okay. So I'm thinking I would like to read this post to get us
Yeah, that's
kicked
good. I could
off.
probably use a refresher.
Cool. I'm going to read it. And then immediately following reading it, Louis, I'm going to pass it over to you to see if you'd like to uh, expound or say a little more about what you mean. And maybe you said it all in the post and you won't want to do that. Or, and then if that's the case, we'll jump to maybe Tony's comment and my comment to get the conversation rolling. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to make sure my notifications are off here. They are. This is a post from 1 week ago. It says, but it feels like more than 1 week ago.
Yeah, it really does. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. Well, last week we tried to do this, so it has to be, I'm going to say
Yeah.
closer to 2 weeks ago. But LinkedIn is telling me 1 week. And the title of the post, if you will, is detach from the outcome. And that is in quotes. And here we go, Louis riffing on that detach from the outcome quote. It's pretty popular advice and in limited medicinal doses, perhaps not bad, but as a general philosophy of life, silly, bordering on disastrous. Not just because we can't really detach from the outcome. If we could, we wouldn't have the whole cottage industry of pop stoicism and books with expletives in the title, making us feel anxious about failing to detach. We're attached to our detachment, but I digress. It's not just that we should detach from the outcome, but cannot. It's that detachment itself isn't a goal towards which one should aspire. If you are working towards a goal, and if you are going through a process directed to an outcome, then you are involved in a goal-oriented activity. You should, with a capital S, care about that goal. That goal, the one you care about, is how you make sense of and evaluate your process. What does it mean to detach here? To go through the motions of the process without concern about whether or not they lead me to my goal? That doesn't even sound rational. If I get in the car to pick up Yuki at college, which am I pronouncing that right? I've only read
Yeah, you
Yuki's
got it.
name. Okay. If I get in the car to pick up Yuki at college, I don't just drive for 7 hours, turning this way and that, and then look up later only to say, whoops, I am in Miami, not Tallahassee. Oversimplification, perhaps, but you get the point. I care about the goal, so I care about the process, and I evaluate each with respect to the other. And I adapt and make changes as necessary, not because I'm, quote, detached from the outcome, end quote, but because I have a passionate concern for the outcome. There's a wave of pop culture wisdom leading us to retreat into solipsism. And while there might be cases where, administered judiciously and with care, this could be beneficial, writ large, it represents a wrong turn. Detach from your detachments and commit to your commitments. We don't need more expletive laden solipsism. We need folks who genuinely care about what they're doing. End of post. Louis, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Yeah. So again, I think there's a way that in small doses detachment is okay, right? I mean, I think we recognize that you can't control every outcome, but if you spend enough time on LinkedIn, as I think I do, maybe too much time, you see that getting pushed way too far. And I think there again, I mean, you go into a bookstore and I probably mentioned this before when I go into the philosophy section and it's all hot takes on stoicism, which again is a noble philosophy, but there's this move, I think, afoot where it really does represent retreat, right? So there is pain that comes when you care about something and it doesn't work out. And something I see in the culture is a move to shield oneself from that pain by retreating and saying, well, just kind of let that go. Like let those results go. All that matters is how you think about something, not what the thing actually is. Right. So it all kind of comes together. And I think again, in small doses, maybe you need that, right? So if you grew up under some kind of oppression where you care too much about what others are telling you that you can't live freely, then maybe you need to get out of that. But as a general way of life to say that, well, I'm not going to care about the outcome. I think about that a lot in terms of parenting, right? So what does it mean to say as a parent that you're going to raise your child but not care about the kind of person they become? I mean, that you should care about the kind of person that they become. If I'm working with a client and I say, well, I'm going to do my job and, the chips will fall where they may, and, that's not really my concern, but I should be concerned about what the outcome for that client is. So my basic way of looking at the world is that you're in the world and attached to it. So we're all connected. We're connected to each other. We're connected to nature. And that is a source of pain and frustration, can be, right? I mean, people let you down, people die, you let other people down, things don't go as planned, and that's again a source of pain. But I'd much rather see an engagement with that process, a reckoning with that pain, an acknowledgement that that pain is meaningful and that there's something to be learned from it, as opposed to, again, what I think is trying to insulate yourself from it by saying, well, just let all that go at the end. Um, that's not a good way to be a person, I would say. And again, I just want to clarify that there are times when you take medicine and it's useful, but not when it becomes the dominant narrative as the ideal to strive for. Like detachment as the ideal is, I think, not a good one.
Tony, you've been thinking away. What are you thinking?
I have been thinking away. Well, Louis, a little more groundwork I'd be interested in is, what do you think of as your philosophical or religious approach to the world generally? Like, do you have an overarching um, uh, school of thought or religion that
Not so
guides
much
you?
religion and probably not one philosophic school of thought that I could point to, but I think when I think about what it means to be human, what it means to be an individual. So I think in the West, particularly strongly, we have this idea that you're this individual one thing first, and then you enter into relationship second. So first, like I do this work on myself and I become who I am. And I'm kind of simplifying this a little bit, but then I go onto the world and I make relationships, right? So individuality is first, relationship is second.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's upside down, right? I think you come into the world, you're actually born already related to, right, a mother that nurtures you. You're born into a culture, into a language. You're already related to that. You're already in relation to the world around you. So as a kind of general orientation, I would say that relationship is first is kind of hard, but but it's not certainly not second, right? So it's in that interplay between you and all these relationships that you only come to be and continually become to be who you are. So again, I think there's this idea, you see it a lot through like, in literature in the West, that I'm going to go off on my own and find myself. And you may find some version of yourself, but again, you take those relationships with you wherever you go. So as a kind of dominant philosophic thought, I would say that relationship is primary, right? And so then when I think about detachment, you can't really detach. You're always related, right? And there's no way that I can go off and detach. Even that whole idea, that romantic idea of I'm going to go off into the woods and find myself. That's a Western romantic idea, right? So that's something that I find in the culture. I mean, you look at Walden, right? I mean, Thoreau is probably one of the great exponents of that. I'm going to go off and so even that whole move, I think, is something that we've learned growing up.
What's an alternative in your mind? So if it's not going out into the woods and finding yourself, or what's the alternative? And then I'm working on a question that has to do with like the individual to community relationship that you're talking about, because it
Yeah.
seems
So I
as
mean,
though that it's still possible to be born into a community and have those relationships, and then still discover something about yourself within that community, but physically away from them, so that re-entering the community
yeah.
is so which is one of our like major premises. So this is going to be a fun exploration of
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to certainly solitude and being alone and reflecting on your place in that community is important. So I don't want to, but so if I think about what it means to go off and be alone and quote unquote find myself.
What if you didn't use that language? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we're
Yeah.
probably fairly close on not using the find myself language, which does
Okay.
seem
I'm
like
fine.
more new,
Yeah.
the meaning attached to that. We're
So
probably closer than, and I'd like to like figure out where we're more different than where we're close.
yeah. So if I think about the value of solitude, which
Yep.
is something that I need quite a bit of, right? So it's part of that is reflecting on who I am, but that always means who I've come to be through those relationships. So I guess, I mean, again, it's not saying that solitude is unimportant. It's not saying that there's nothing to be discovered there. It's just that even still, we're still invested in those relationships. And so we're working out, what do I find the value in, say, the cultural values that I've inherited, right? So even if I'm saying I want to somehow reject them or transfigure them or what have you, you're still in relationship to those values, to that community. So that's again, I think it's really just reorienting what it means to be the individual. And it's, for me, it's that process of dialogue with the relationships that A, you're kind of thrown into, and then B, you seek out. So you can certainly seek out new relationships and new, that's what we do when we read, that's what we do when we travel, that's what we do when we encounter others. I guess what I want to reject, and you might agree, is that there is this quote unquote thing, self, that kind of has these hard borders that then goes and enters into relationship, as opposed to a self which is in constant process of creation through those very relationships. And it's, to me, what that means is I can't think about the self without thinking about those relationships. And those relationships become of primary importance. And going back to the original post, I should care about the quality of those relationships quite passionately, because they are at the core then of everything. So to say that I'm going to be in a relation and not care about the outcome, again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, strikes me as just a way that we try to insulate ourselves from the implications of what it means to be in a relationship, right? You're in a relationship with your wife. I take it that you care very deeply about that relationship. If that were to go wrong and, the two of you were to split up, and I came to you and said, well, you did your best, so just detach from the outcome. I mean, that would just strike you as absurd, and it should, right? So, I think a more healthy thing to say is, yeah, there's real pain there, right? You put a lot of yourself into that relationship. Not just that you put yourself into that relationship, the self that you are is largely a result of that relationship, right? So if that relationship goes wrong, that is close to a mortal wound to who you are, right? And then to say, well, you did everything that a father or husband could do, so detach from the outcome, that just doesn't get it right for me, right? So you should care, right? I mean, if you come home and you try to do something and your wife takes it the wrong way, right? You made her coffee and she's like, oh, this is terrible. You don't say, well, I made you coffee, right? you care about her, you care about your relationship, and you try to say, how can I improve that? Right? It hurts. And it should hurt. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It should hurt.
I'm up now. I'm ready.
All right.
So where you started, Louis, with the detachment in small doses makes sense. We've got a point of agreement there. And so maybe what we're talking about is a question of degree, of how much detachment from outcomes makes sense. And my own story, and I think of myself sort of as a guerrilla philosopher, not the animal, but but in the sense that
The insurgent philosopher?
what's that?
Like an insurgent philosopher?
There you go. Yeah, in the sense that I think of myself as somebody who will try to collect enough resources to be able to achieve the objective, and then I don't really worry about going much further beyond that. So I've Evan and I connected early this year over our takes on philosophy and God and becoming better versions of ourselves. And I described myself to him early on as philosophically and religiously promiscuous, spiritually promiscuous. And I tend to pull from a lot of different traditions in how I think about this stuff. But I write pretty openly about my alcoholism and about kind of how my life was falling apart in my 20s. And the problem that I was running into at that time in my life, and a problem that I think is really common in our culture, is that we are too attached to outcomes, that we are too attached to our sense of self, that we're too self-centered, and that we are too wrapped up in our own stuff to be able to sort of see reality accurately. Like it seems, and this speaks to your point about Thoreau and Walden, and that romantic ideal of the saying, screw all to the world, I'm going to go out and do my own thing and find myself. And I actually have a line from Thoreau tattooed on my forearm. I'm a fan of that, guys. But but I think we have in the West, and the individualism that we've grown up with, it's a real problem. And I take this as something that has filled the void of the tribelessness that we now experience in modern life and postmodern life. And this, frankly, is sort of the foundation of what we're doing with Wilds in the Woods, is how best should we engage with a world where we, as you're saying, as inherently social creatures, as creatures who need relationship to certainly to thrive and possibly even to survive. What do we do in this time where we're continually more nuclearized, we're less communal, we're less connected to one another in a way? To me, it's the biggest problem of our time. And so where I see that going is this thing where me as a 23-year-old kid sees myself as the star of the show. Like, I'm the movie star. Everybody else in my life is sort of supporting cast. And I'm living out the movie of my life, where everything good that happens to me is obviously good, and everything bad that happens to me is something I want to avoid. Right? I want to avoid pain. I want to avoid anything that isn't on that up and to the right trajectory towards success and health and happiness. Right. where I get everything I want and I avoid everything I don't want. And so I see myself, and I talk about my rock bottom moment in that Guamanian jail cell in 2009. And, I'm drunk and I'm overweight and I'm lonely and I was attached to everything at that point in my life. And it was after that I started spending more time with, I spent time with AA and that program had a profound impact on me. And one of the sort of mantras you come out of those rooms with is the serenity prayer, right? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? And so that prayer is inherently about detachment, right? It's about
except, and I think we don't actually disagree.
Mhm.
I think what gets lost in that prayer and kind of the pop culture way of appropriating things, and I'm not accusing you of this, the wisdom to know the difference. And I think, right, that there are things that we can't change, then maybe that's where, again, medicinal use of detachment comes in and thinking about what things you should detach from. But the crux of that prayer is the wisdom to know the difference. Whereas I see a lot of what passes for quote unquote wisdom is the erasure of that line, right? Detach from, like, kind of let everything go. I apologize, I interrupted you, but
No, you're fine. Well, yeah, and I think that may be where we do disagree. Um, so the wisdom to know the difference between the two, to me, is largely about letting go. Like that wisdom is not by me making the correct assessments necessarily of the difference between what I can change and what I can't change. It's, you had said early on, this idea that we're connected to other people, we're connected to the world around us. And that's what I've found to be the answer to that question of wisdom, right? It's not a matter, like, my problem most of my life is that I've been told I'm too smart, right? Like that's, and I don't say that as a pat on my back. I say that as in my brain gets me in a lot of trouble, because I tend to think I'm smart enough to figure anything out, right? And the reality is, when I stay between my ears, it doesn't work very well. That for me to have my life go better, and this is one of the things I've learned over the last 12 years, I actually need to think less and I need to open up more. I need to listen more. I need to take more in. I need to pay attention more rather than trying to impose my will on the world around me, right? And I think I think that resonates with where you're coming from. I started spending more time with Eastern stuff. So when you said that finding yourself being a Western idea, the Buddha was a guy who went off on his own,
sure.
and right, and he just
Gave up
disclaimed
all his wealth and
his royalty, and he gave up all his stuff, and he just went out, and the sadhus and the holy men in Hinduism, people who just go out and they just start walking. So that idea of detachment, it's a very old idea, and I think taken to its extreme, you and I probably start to come together, where it's like, if you are somebody who's kind of wandering without connection to people, without, no family, no friends, you're just kind of, I want to say, like the, well, just disconnected, that in a way that could be the pinnacle of detachment. It doesn't strike me as a particularly desirable way to live, right? So I think by the time we get to that sort of example, I agree, because I think that person, I don't know. I've never actually talked to a person who's in that situation, so maybe I don't know. But there's a level of freedom that comes with that. But what are you missing out on at that point by virtue of having gotten free by not caring or not being attached to anything?
Yeah, that to me, that sounds like a hollow kind of empty freedom.
Yeah.
Can I ask a more personal question then, since you shared some of your story? And you can just obviously decline to answer, but you kind of mentioned that part of your journey was being too attached to the graph going up and to the right, right? These successful outcomes. And that led you into places that you didn't want to be. And so part of getting out of that is stepping back from, is it fair to say, a certain understanding of what success means?
That's certainly been part of what I've been doing. Yeah.
Okay. So you recognize that maybe that was not the right measure of success. And I think you and I agree that you called it tribelessness, right? Not having community is one of the most fundamental problems that people face. So again, so here I wonder how much we actually do disagree, because I would say it's one thing to say I was focused on the wrong measures of success, and so I'm letting those go. And now I see what it actually means to be a thriving human being in the full sense of the word, that's more about opening up to others, connection, community, right? So I don't interpret that as being detached, because you're realizing that what you should care about is not, in your case, material markers of success, but the quality of relationship that you're in, right? And I'm going to guess, by what I know about what you told me so far in your conversations and what I've had with Evan, that you care very deeply about the quality of those relationships. You care very deeply about fostering that kind of community where there is real connection, real openness, real possibility for that kind of exchange where you can become a better version of yourself. That's something that you are, again, committed to. And so to me, I look at that and I say, yes, right? You should care about those things. You should be committed to those things. That to me doesn't look like detachment at all. That looks like reordering one's values away from a false sense of security, perhaps, or a false sense of what it means to be a happy, thriving human being, and reordering oneself to something that is more deeply fulfilling, that you do care about, right? And so again, if I were to say to you, like, imagine that you and Evan spent this time building and trying to foster these communities, and it ended like Lord of the Rings, I'm going to guess that that would be a profound blow, right? That you wouldn't just say, well, we tried and, it didn't work out. You would say, where did we go wrong? How can we do better? What did we overlook? How can we start again, right? So that would be a cause for some real deep reflection on how to do that better. To me, that shows, again, real concern, real commitment, real care. I think that's exactly right, right? So I'd make a distinction, I think, between recognizing what values one ought to be committed to and saying, so I'm not going to commit to making a whole lot of money, right? That's just not important. That's not, to me, that's not what I mean by detachment or attachment. But when I see you saying, these are the things I care about, these are the things that really matter, you're not just going to say, these are the things that really matter, but I don't care about the outcome, right? That's the word I used was irrational, right? You care about those things, so you care about the outcome. If the outcome isn't what you had hoped, that's cause for further reflection, not just, I don't know how many books there are that curse in the title, like, well, F it, I'm just going to reorient how it ended in Lord of the Rings. Nothing wrong with Lord of the Rings. It's all how I think about Lord of the Rings. I mean, that to me, that's just, like, no, I mean, if that's the outcome, that's not a good outcome, right? Objectively, that's a bad outcome. Like, you don't want people killing each other, right? So, that move whereby, again, we try to insulate ourselves by saying it's not the thing itself that's good or bad, it's only how we view it, that has its limits, right? And again, I think the things that we most care about, we ought not detach ourselves from those outcomes, right?
All right, I'll launch into another story. So I torched my legal career for the first time in 2013. Took a one-way ticket to Bangkok after selling all my stuff, quitting my job, yada yada. From 2013 to 2017, I sort of was that guy detaching from a lot of stuff, detaching from.
But what were you attaching to? What were you committed to?
We're about to get to that. A book I ran across, or really, Anthony DeMello was a Jesuit priest from India whose stuff has influenced me more than almost anyone else's. And his book, Rediscovering Life, which I first read in 2014, shortly before meeting the woman who would become my wife, there's this idea he presents that says, where there is attachment, there can't be love. This is coming from a Catholic priest who grew up in a Hindu culture. So he's like this melding of East and West. But the idea is saying that, if I'm saying I can't be happy without you, I need you to be happy, then that's actually something different than love. That's a form of selfishness, actually. And this idea was so challenging to me because for me and my romantic history up to that point, I had almost ended up engaged on 2 different occasions. Lucky for everyone involved, those didn't happen. I would have been a very difficult person to be engaged and or married to at that time. Arguably, I still am. But to me, love had been attachment. And that relationship continuing, and it could be whoever, just being in a relationship saying, I want this to continue, I don't want this person to leave me, would dictate how I behave, right? So it's attaching to the outcome of the relationship continuing, regardless of whether that relationship actually should continue. So I meet my wife in early 2015. We end up getting engaged at the end of that year. We end up getting married in the middle of 2016. By the middle of 2017, our marriage is in danger. Things that have not gone well. We're both in our mid-30s at this point. We had met traveling in India, actually on the first day of a 10-day silent meditation retreat while waiting for our room assignments is where we met. And she was also in this time where she had left her career as a dental hygienist and had gone back to school. Now was spending 6 months in India. And so we're both basically living out of backpacks and traveling. And that's how we spent the first couple of years of our relationship for the most part. Then we came to this point of, what are we going to do? Is we want to have a family. We got married because we're interested in having a family. We're in her parents' basement, like as kind of our home base while she's trying to finish her degree in Toronto. I'm doing like part-time contract work as an attorney. I made like $120,000 over the course of those 4 years, right? So we're getting by on relatively little income. And there came a point of something has to give, right? And it's easy to look back from where I am now and connect the dots in a particular way. But we ended up separating for a short period of time in the summer of 2017. And the idea that was guiding me at this point was the marriage was not working the way it was going. And I'm not like, the way this went down was not at all graceful, and it was not at all pretty, and it sure as hell was not fun. It was very painful. But the idea being that if we continue down the trajectory we're on, it's not going to get where we're trying to get it to go. So there was a point where I actually ended up heading to Mexico for a short period of time. And to me, that was an act of detachment from saying, okay, I need to make sure this works regardless of whether or not we're all miserable, right? Because that's the way we were going. So there was a point where saying, okay, if the choice is our being happy or my being happy or staying in this relationship, I'm going to choose happiness. I'm going to choose our having a shot at that, even if it's not together. Right? To me, that's taking a leap in favor of detachment. Now,
I read that completely opposite.
Yeah, I know. This is a counterintuitive approach, but what happened while in Mexico is I came to a point where I was presented with a choice. I could fly to Colombia and spend some time down there, or I could fly to St. Louis and interview for a job that might be materializing. I thought it might. If I flew to Colombia, I knew that my marriage was pretty much over. Like I was just going back out, right? I was heading back out into the wilderness, into that period of detachment in a way that my wife was probably then going to start a new degree program in Toronto, and the two paths were going to have a really hard time coming back together. If I went to St. Louis, my marriage was still in trouble. It was still in big trouble. But at that point, we got a job. We have more of an income. We have the foundations upon which you can start to build a life and a family. Right? I didn't know that the job was actually there yet. There were some other moving pieces, and I had to make the choice. I chose to fly to St. Louis. The way it unfolded, I get the job, I get the apartment, and my wife and I have a conversation one night where I'm saying, I'm sorry, I don't know how we're going to turn this around. And this was about 3 weeks after I'd started this. No, 10 days after I'd started this new job. And she said, we're not quitting. And so, okay, we're not quitting. And, we got a therapist. We worked through some stuff. She agreed to move to St. Louis after finishing her degree, which was going to be 6 months after that. And that's what happened. Like, she came to St. Louis. We had our first baby in 2018 then, and now we've got our second baby, and we've moved up to Canada, and we've been married for 6.5 years. And I really like our chances of hitting 7 years. I think we're going to make it. I love my life. I love my wife. My marriage is the most important relationship in my life. So much of the good stuff in my life is a direct result of my marriage. I don't think I'm here having this conversation with you with this life I'm absolutely loving living because of my family, right? My family, to your point, those relationships being the central piece. I'm not here doing that had I not been willing to let it go in 2017. And my wife actually would probably disagree with this. And we'll let her. My wife doesn't listen to my other podcast about LinkedIn. She listens to every one of this. So she's going to listen to this. She will let me know if she disagrees with what I'm saying right here. But, and I'm not saying that I was a genius or telling the future. by saying, this is how we're going to save the marriage. No, it was me making that call. I think it goes back to the serenity prayer, that wisdom to know the difference, saying, I can't control these particular things. All I can do is try to make the best decision. And had I not been willing to make that decision in favor of our happiness in a way that took us apart, it doesn't come back together.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said it, well, there's a lot in here that I think is worth thinking
That
through.
was a long story. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, but I think I would say just a couple of things. First, I mean, you started with love, which I thought was interesting, right? So again, I think there is, and you brought this up, a wrong way of looking at love, which is not love, but just possession, right? I need to possess this to feel good about myself, and that's not love. And I don't think you quite used the words, but what I heard you say is that, and this is kind of what I would say real love is about, is wanting the good of the other person, right? If you love someone, you want their good.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm just going to kind of flip things around, right? You said that you went to Mexico and it was kind of like detaching from particular outcome, right? Saving the marriage as a thing, right? Of that relationship. But what you never gave up on was your commitment to the happiness of the people involved, right? Yourself and your wife, right? So there is, again, a real concern and commitment for the other person, which is real love, that you remain committed and attached to throughout the whole process. Mm-hmm. And so it's, again, when I look at a story like that, I don't think of that as one of detachment per se, but getting clarity on where the real attachment is and ought to be, right? So, and again, I think you hit on it, that the real thing is the quality of that relationship. Marriage is one way that relationship might be maintained, but there are lots of other ways, right? So if we focus too much on, and maybe again, medicinal use of detachment, on the external marker and not on the substance, we get confused. And so you move to Mexico, that doesn't break your commitment or attachment to the substance of that relationship, the quality of that relationship, the concern and love for the well-being of not just yourself, but your wife. To that, you remain committed and care, right? And so I mean, again, maybe we're just using language differently. You said that you detached from the marriage. Okay, maybe. But to me, it's just getting clarity on what is the real thing, the core of that matters, right? And not wavering in your commitment and concern for that, and being willing to say, right, this is love. I love you enough that if that means that we have to dissolve the marriage and I'll be miserable, that's the important thing here, right? That we desire the good of one another. And that's not, again, something that you were willing to let go of, right? You're committed to that. You care about that. There's a passionate concern there. And I think, I mean, again, I think we kind of share this viewpoint that those connections and those relationships are what make life meaningful. The kind of way that, I mean, whether you call it marriage or friendship or whatever, is kind of less important. But the quality of that relationship, however it manifests itself, is what's at the heart of things. And I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't seem like you gave up your commitment and attachment to that.
No. And as you were talking, what came to mind is a line from the prophet Khalil Gibran's book. You don't actually achieve true freedom until even the desire for freedom is a chain that you're trying to rid yourself of. And yeah, I think that's right. That as I was detaching from the outcome of whether the marriage continued to some degree, I was remaining very much attached to this idea that happiness is the thing to pursue. And so, yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. So, yeah,
Yeah. So I mean,
good.
again, if I go back to that original post, I think there's lots of ways that we get distracted about from what's really important. I think Evan and I have talked about this. I think from what I pick up from you, I think you would agree that it's easy to get hoodwinked by the wrong things and chase the wrong outcomes. And so there is a lot to be gained from evaluating the things that we're pursuing, changing focus, but that's different in my mind to this, again, kind of pop culture claim that we should kind of wholesale detach from outcomes across the board. Because when I think about that, again, I'm going to come back to things that really matter. And this is maybe, for those things that ultimately matter, we have to be concerned and committed to those outcomes. That's, I mean, you can't not do it. I mean, I don't know what it means to say that I care about something, and yet I'm not concerned about how it shakes out in the end. That, to me, it just sounds like a logical contradiction, right? So again, maybe it's not the form of the marriage, but the quality of the relationship, right?
Can I interrupt there for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to make sure I'm repeating this back to you and making the best use of our time here too. You said you don't think it's rational, or this statement is irrational, that you don't know how to say you care about something and also not be concerned about the outcome. Am I repeating that back to you accurately? Could you rephrase that for me? Because I want
Right.
to.
So yeah.
I want
So
to.
if you think about the things that are most important, right? The things that really matter. For me, I can tell you that one of those things is being a father, right? That I never wanted to be a father. I never wanted to get married, so that was never something that was on my to-do list, as it were. But it's been, maybe it's cliche and kind of silly, but one of the most meaningful things that I think I've done with my life is raise two daughters. So I'm deeply concerned about what it means for me to be a father, how that plays out in the lives of my daughter, how I'm impacting them, what that means for them. So to say that that's something I really care about, and yet at the same time, I don't care about the kind of people they become, or I'm going to detach myself from the outcome. So if we have a bad relationship, that somehow I'm just going to say, well, I really tried hard and didn't work out. Oh, well. That I can't square those two kinds of claims, right?
So it
And
seems like
that's
though that's grief at that point though. Like it has less to do with attaching to the outcome and more to do with engaging in the process of grief in my mind. So if I,
grief, did you say?
yeah, grief. So like I do want my children to grow up and be functioning humans and live a fulfilling and meaningful life. There is a path. There are options. There are choices that they could make that could lead to the opposite of that, which would cause me grief.
Right. Yeah, grief.
I
Exactly.
don't think that attachment to the outcome. I think there's still the ability to be detached from the outcome and engage with the process of grief.
I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but like if I said, and again, I think this goes back to kind of the conversation I was having with Tony. So like if I think about what I want them to be happy, of course, but I want them to lead meaningful lives, and that's different than I think the way we use happy. I want them to thrive in a certain way. I want our relationship to be one that's open and close and warm. That's an outcome that I'm deeply committed to, right? Now,
But you don't have control over it.
no, I can't make it happen, but I
Right.
can do all of the things and work on myself to give it the best possibility for happening. And again,
Yeah.
I think part of what I react to when I see kind of, again, pop culture hot takes on this stuff is that there's stuff that I have control over and there's stuff that I don't have control over. But really life is there's a whole lot of gray in there, right? And
Yeah.
there's a move to kind of eliminate that gray and say, if you don't have control over it, put it out of your mind. Which to me ignores all that gray area, which is, yeah, I don't have control. There's nothing I can do to make that relationship or make those things that I want to happen. But I know that, for example, with my youngest daughter, who took me a long time to come into a relationship with, I can do a lot of work on myself to improve the quality of that relationship.
Yep.
Right? I can't force it. I can't, but to say that I have no control over, therefore I'm just going to say, well, I mean,
so the way that are you okay if I interrupt here?
yeah, of course.
Okay. The way that I reconcile these two things, I use a word because I appreciate that gray area of like, I don't have control over a lot of things. I tend to lean more on the detach from the outcome side of this spectrum that we're kind of talking about here.
I don't think you do.
Say that again.
I don't think you do, and I don't think Tony does either.
Well, so this is we're dealing with a language communication. I agree with you because I think once we could get down to it, detach from the outcome or.
Well, I'm going to ask if I can interrupt you for a second just to get clarity here.
Yeah.
Suppose in, I don't know, 25 years, one of your children is living a life that is unhealthy in all sorts of ways and has closed all forms of communication to you and your wife. I take it you would grieve. To me, I read that grief only comes about because you really care about that not being desirable outcome for the relationship, for your child, for yourself. You are committed to that, right? You are not detached from that. And you would grieve and you would say, where did this go wrong? How can I repair this? Right? And that grief, I think, again, is, so I know that we're getting to 9 and we maybe need to follow up, but there seems to be, again, kind of this idea that we should avoid grief. Right? I'm not saying that you and Tony have this view, but I'm saying that you look at kind of some of the messages that we're getting, we should avoid grief. And I take it that the way you live your life and what I hear from Tony is that you need to be open to that grief in a real way. Recognize that you can't control everything, so there's always a possibility for grief. But live a life in a way that not tries to avoid it, but if you, again, I know a bit about you as a father. I know you don't just wash your hands of things, right? So, Tony wanted to say something.
Yeah, the idea of detachment from outcomes for me is a strategy. That detaching from outcomes is the best way to bring about the outcomes I want to bring about. There's a Buddhist say about archery, right? That the archer, when there's nothing on the line, is able to focus on what he's doing, right? When there's a few coins, when there's a small bet, he gets a little bit distracted, right? But when the golden buckle is on the line, you really need to focus, right? There's just, your mind is getting drawn to the shiny object over there, right? So it's like, as the stakes rise, it gets harder to focus on the inputs that are going to bring about the outcomes you want, right? So when I talk about detachment, it's like, I mean, we got this problem in our culture with helicopter parenting, right? And being a teacher is getting harder and harder because not because the kids are attention spans and stuff and screens and all that's getting more challenging, but the parents are a total pain in the ass, right? Because parents are reverse engineering success in a way that's saying my child needs to get an A in 5th grade math, right? So like there's this, we're trying to control, we're trying to control what's going on right here because we're trying to control what's going on 20 years from now, right? So like for me, this idea of detachment is saying, yeah, like it's going to kill me if my kids aren't in relationship with me 20 years from now. Like, I mean, that hurts. That just, even contemplating the possibility really hurts, right? So, and like, I don't ever intend to detach from that feeling of my, like, I am a romantic at heart. Like there's that piece. So I think we're in agreement on that. For me, it is strategic. We're saying the best way for me to get to 20 years down the line where me and my kids are fully in relationship is for me to not worry about that today, right? And worry about this thing that's right in front of me, right? This thing that I can control. And it goes this line from the Bhagavad Gita of you're entitled to your labor. You're not entitled to the fruits of your labor. That it's by focusing on the labor today and then letting the chips fall as they may, because we have to, we can't control what happens all the time, that focusing and doing the best we can today is, and this goes back, to be honest with you, I thought your driving example is terrible. Like that, I think that was just, I think it was almost, I don't like the term straw manning, but it was straw manning. Like nobody's going to do that, right? That's just goofy. Nobody's going to do that, right? So it's like I can be detached from the idea. Say, okay, I'm trying to get to where she goes to Florida State, Tallahassee. So I'm just saying, like I'm focusing on the next best move to try to bring about that outcome.
So
I rolled again.
Attached to the outcome in the sense that you will grieve. So this is, I think, the main. We have to end with this. This is where I'm landing on what we're talking about here. Is Tony? It seems as though I think I'm aligning with how you're talking about this, and Louis, I think it's not too far from what you're getting at. I'm going to try to say something that we all agree on.
I think it's
we are attached to the outcome.
Yeah.
I think it's good to be attached to an outcome insofar as we engage with the grief that arises when an outcome that we desire does not happen. We have no control over that outcome. So the best path to that outcome is actually to do the work to let go of that outcome and be present where we are today. Like the path of attachment is detachment. The path there we go. The path of attachment.
Yeah, I'll take that.
So it is good to be attached to an outcome that causes grief, and it's good to engage with that grief. And maybe the best path to an outcome that we're attached to is to let go of that outcome.
I'm uneasy with that for lots of reasons, but all right.
Well, yeah, I didn't expect that we would come around to be fully aligned, but it's really important ground to cover, you know, and to flesh out.
Yeah.
Louis, closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts.
Yes.
Fair point that the driving example was a bit of a straw man. No argument there. I don't know how to have a closing thought for all this, but I would say, as a kind of just going back to like the big thing that I take away from that conversation is that as a general approach to life, I would kind of reject one that tries to insulate you from pain, suffering, and grief, instead of using that as something that one can learn from. Again, I think that relationships are primary, and that what it means to be an individual is all wrapped up in those relationships. I don't think we disagree there.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that there's, again, to come back to some of this, there's an important distinction to be made between reevaluating one's priorities and the goals that one has and letting go of the ones that are off the mark or maybe hit the surface but not the depth, right? So, but when we find the heart of those things, the things that really are most important, most essential, it's those things that we ought remain committed passionately to, not just the process, but again, the outcome, right? And I think we always are, right, for those things. And it's I think part of when like Tony goes to Mexico and is kind of trying to make sense of this, it's fine. It's there where you can kind of, I mean, use that pain or that impending pain to sort out what is the real thing here versus what is just the external markers. And as long as you remain committed to the real thing and not just the external markers, then, and maybe this is where Tony and I use detachment differently, but if you detach from the marker but commit to the underlying substance, then yeah, you've got a better chance of, I would say, give up the idea of control, but not influence. You can influence that outcome. And if we care about the outcome, we should care about doing the work to influence as best we can that outcome. You put the working with your children, you put the working with your marriage. That's not telling me that you give up. I mean, you can't control it, but you can influence it. You can take responsibility for it.
Responsibility is the word that's been coming to my mind throughout this entire conversation. A detachment that leads to somebody not taking responsibility or being present to the process is an unhealthy detachment.
Yeah,
A detachment that leads to somebody being more engaged with the process and more taking on more responsibility is a healthy form of detachment. And I think there are such things as healthy forms of detachment. And maybe that's where we would get on a broader tangent. And then I've got one last thing. And then I think I'm going to say the last thing on this podcast, if that's okay with you too. I know, Louis, you're not getting to say everything that you're wanting to. And I know Tony isn't either. So I want to acknowledge that. And well, in saying this, say thank you. This has been a meaningful conversation for me to participate in. And we talked about grief slightly. I think going more into grief would be a proper follow-up to this conversation, honestly. And based on my understanding and experience of grief, the last stage is a form of detachment that we call acceptance. And so acceptance and grief seem to be where I would take this conversation from here to get more clarity on detachment. But there's something to that, and lean into the hard things, like you were saying, Louis. I think that's a good path to follow. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening to the Unrationed podcast. Follow Louis on LinkedIn and Tony. Louis, do you say your last name Colombo?
Yes.
Louis Colombo on LinkedIn. Tony Albrecht, you're probably already connected on LinkedIn
We are.
if you're listening to this. And so, yeah, that's the best way to engage in these further philosophical discussions. That's where this one started. And I'm sure we will have more on LinkedIn and potentially on the podcast from here.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yep.
And Tony, great to meet you.
A pleasure. Ow!